both guys look very, very tense in the first couple rounds. And even though the tension did disperse to some extent as the rounds wore on, it remained relatively tense for the entire duration of the bout. Interestingly, and for me, surprisingly, Kubrat Pulev did not fight his normal fight, which is to fight a fiddly fight, basically. Stay on the outside, use in and out movement, and focus on landing his jab. In this fight, Kubrat Pulev dispensed with his jab almost entirely. It was clear after a couple rounds of action that Kubrat Pulev had one thing and one thing only on his mind in this fight, and that was knocking Anthony Joshua out. He didn't come to have a jabbing contest. He didn't come to have a fiddly fight. He came to try and land a big right hand and knock Anthony Joshua out. That was his entire game plan. Normally, Kubrat Pulev will fight with his left hand extended, right? His left arm extended, and he'll kind of wave it around. That is to distract you, to blind you. Then he'll turn it into a jab suddenly. That's how Kubrat Pulev normally fights. That's his normal boxing stance. In this fight, he was fighting with his gloves much closer to his head than I've ever seen him fight before. He was obviously mindful of Anthony Joshua's hooks from the left or the right side. That's why he had the hand so close. He maybe was also mindful of what happened in that Vladimir Klitschko fight. And perhaps he'd heard that AJ had been talking to Klitschko. Maybe advising him, you need to throw hooks against this guy. Don't get into throwing straight shots, throw hooks. Now, AJ didn't fight the way that the old Anthony Joshua used to fight. This was kind of a mix between the version who fought Andy Ruiz and the old Anthony Joshua. So first couple rounds, very, very tense. Both guys struggling to loosen up. But in the third round, AJ started to relax a bit more, whereas Pulev was still very tight. And again, not really going for his jab. He landed a few jabs to AJ's chest, but wasn't anywhere near as committed to the jab as he normally is. Again, fighting with his hands much closer to his head than usual. So he wasn't getting that range, judging that distance with that antenna out there, that extended left arm. So AJ relaxed earlier than Pulev did. He got through some big shots in round 3 and was able to drop Kubrat Pulev. Now, it looked as though AJ could get Pulev out of there in that third round, and I spoke in my video pre-fight and said that AJ does have the potential to get Pulev out early if he opens up early, because Pulev really can't fight up close at all. He's a long-range guy. It's long range or nothing. But AJ did let Kubrat Pulev off the hook. And it was clear to me that AJ was still battling those demons from the Andy Ruiz fight. Because even though he attacked Pulev with some ferocity at times, he then held back. I don't just think it was because he was concerned about getting clipped with a shot. He was also concerned about gassing out. He didn't want that to happen. He wanted to have plenty of gas left in the tank. So he didn't really push the issue as much as he could have, as much as, for example, Peter Fury wanted him to. Peter Fury was in attendance. Obviously, his son Huey fought on the undercard, and he was asked about AJ's performance, and he said he could have got Pulev out of it earlier. He let him off the hook. He let him back into the fight, and he did. But I also said pre-fight that this could turn out to be a good learning experience for Anthony Joshua. And I think that's exactly what it turned out to be. I think this fight helped Anthony Joshua exercise some of those demons. Because although he dominated the fight, in fact, he barely lost a round. Did Pulev even win one round? Even though he dominated, Pulev always looked dangerous. And Anthony Joshua, let's be real, he always looked vulnerable throughout this fight. Joshua didn't have the swagger that the old AJ had. He still had this look of, extreme focus, but there was tension there. There was, again, a certain vulnerability about AJ in this fight, which is, again, a spillover from that first Andy Ruiz fight. But as the rounds wore on, AJ was landing his jab. He won the battle of the jabs here. There really was no battle of the jabs. Pulev really wasn't jabbing, which again surprised me because that's his best weapon. So in his second tilt for a world title, he abandons his best weapon and says to himself, forget about that. I'm not even going to try and win a decision. I'm just going to try and knock this guy out. I found that a bizarre strategic choice. So AJ was the one landing all the jabs. He was controlling everything from distance. He was moving around. Pulev was trying to close him down. And he did throw some very fast right hands, but most of them missed the mark. AJ was able to pull his head out of the way. And if they did land, he took the sting out of them. And, he was moving around jabbing. Occasionally, he'd engage up close. He'd go with the uppercut, which is one of AJ's best punches, if not his very best punch. And that is generally what got Kubrat Pulev in trouble, is when AJ started going with the uppercut. There were moments in this fight, in the mid-rounds, where AJ would get a couple uppercuts off, but he wasn't really fully committed to the uppercut. You could see that when he was on the inside, he was thinking about an exit strategy already. He was thinking, okay, if this shot doesn't hurt him the way I want it to hurt him, I need to find where the exit is so I can get out of here before he starts firing back. That was AJ's attitude. It wasn't until really the very end of the fight where AJ sat down. He did it in the third round as well when he dropped Kubrat Pulev. But it wasn't until much later on when Pulev started to weaken coming up to the 9th round. And then in the 9th round, the AJ really sat down and threw the uppercut properly again. Got enough power on it to actually take Kubrat Pulev out. And that's what he managed to do. In the 9th, put his punches together, dropped Kubrat Pulev once. Pulev got up. Very brave man throughout the fight. And AJ ended the bout with a right hand, straight right hand down the pipe. And down went Kubrat Pulev in very similar fashion to how he did against Vladimir Klitschko, although I think Vladimir Klitschko's left hook, which he finished Kubrat Pulev with, was even more devastating than AJ's right hand. Now, Kubrat Pulev, I'm not accusing him of anything here at all, okay? I'm just talking about his demeanor and his mindset. But Kubrat Pulev behaved like a guy who was high. He just... In that third round when he got dropped, for example, there was one moment where he turned away. He turned his back on AJ and he almost ran. And he got dropped a couple times and he got to his feet and he was gesturing and acting like a crazy man. And he did some similar things to that in the Klitschko fight, but far more extreme here. He just seemed mentally wired against AJ here. It seemed like he was on a mission. And, if I didn't know any better, and I'm sure he wasn't, I'd think he was high on something in this fight, the way he fought. It was bizarre. A strange performance from Pulev, but definitely a brave one. And even after the bout, when Pulev had been knocked out, he was still like shouting at AJ and saying stuff. It's like, what is going on with this guy? Very, very odd. But overall, I thought it was a good performance by Anthony Joshua. He looked vulnerable. Let's be real about it. He did look vulnerable. He still doesn't have 100% faith in his chin. He still doesn't have 100% faith in his stamina. He is definitely still recovering psychologically from that first Andy Ruiz fight. But this fight here against Pulev will go a long way to aid in that recovery. Because as I started saying before but didn't finish, this is a fight where, even though Anthony Joshua dominated in terms of scoring, he always felt in danger. Pulev was throwing big shots at him. Pulev was committed to the knockout. And he showed a lot of toughness and bravery in there. He wasn't scared of Anthony Joshua. He was going for it. And coming through a fight like that with a very live opponent who's absolutely gunning for the knockout will help exercise those demons, because he was in there with a guy who was trying to do that, but was ultimately unsuccessful. Ultimately, Pulev's plan completely backfired on him. and he got dropped several times and knocked out. So going forward, when Anthony Joshua's in a similar situation with an opponent who's absolutely gunning for the knockout, he's going to be a little less nervous, a little less tense than he was in this fight. See, because that's what experience does for you. The ghosts of Andy Ruiz were living in his mind, telling him that if you get in an exchange, you're going to get knocked out again. If this guy can get close to you and land his right hand, you're going to get hurt. Pulev did land his right hand a couple times. AJ took it okay, although Pulev's never been a devastating puncher. Okay. And for the most part, I think he might have landed 1 or 2 solid shots on AJ, but the majority of the shots that Kubrat Pulev landed were only grazing AJ. AJ was moving away, taking his sting off him, so he never really landed properly flush because AJ was so defensive-minded, or at least defensively aware throughout the fight. And I have drawn comparisons to Lennox Lewis before, particularly after Lewis got knocked out by Oliver McCall. It took Lennox Lewis several fights to get his swagger back, to get his mojo back, to get that old confidence back. How long is it going to take AJ? On that performance right there, he won't beat Tyson Fury. He'll need to be better than that. He'll need to have a lot more confidence in himself than that. Peter Fury also mentioned the fact that Anthony Joshua is still too upright. I completely agree. And you really wonder why, because he's got several coaches. Rob McCracken, the other guy, the gentleman whose name escapes me, Spanish guy, and a few others who help out. But the guy still fights so upright. There's very little upper body movement from Anthony Joshua. He doesn't bend at the waist. Doesn't vary his height, you know? And people were talking about why Tyson Fury wasn't ringside. And by the way, Floyd Mayweather was ringside. It's interesting that Mayweather and Joshua are so tight. And they're not bosom buddies or anything, but there's clearly a mutual respect between the pair of them, and it has been for several years. And it's just interesting the way that Mayweather has always seemed to like Joshua more than his countryman Deontay Wilder. Isn't that interesting? Perhaps it's because they have a similar mentality. You know, neither one of them is a very charismatic person, Joshua or Mayweather, and neither one of them is particularly emotional. They're both very business-minded individuals. So maybe there's a certain simpatico, you know, a certain similarity in mentality, and that's why they're drawn to each other like that. But he was in attendance. Tyson Fury wasn't in attendance. And many are speculating that the reason he decided not to show up to the fight is because his uncle, Peter Fury, was there. And his cousin Huey obviously was fighting on the undercard. Because it's fairly well known that Peter and Huey have fallen out with Tyson and John. And I could go into what I've heard about the situation in terms of why they're falling out, but maybe I'll save that for another video. But he wasn't there, and Peter Fury refused to commit on a prediction in terms of who he thought would win between AJ and Fury. And that is surprising, isn't it? Given the fact that Peter used to be Tyson Fury's trainer, and that's his uncle. You would think that a family member would just come straight out and say, Tyson will beat Anthony Joshua. You got the sense that Peter Fury wanted to say that because I think he believes that, but for some reason he didn't say it. And I can only imagine it's because there is this tension between himself and his brother John and Tyson. I also get the sense, and this is controversial, that Peter Fury, and look, surely this will never happen, but stranger things have happened. Boxing is a strange game. But I also get the sense that Peter Fury probably wouldn't mind training Anthony Joshua. That would be the ultimate betrayal if he ever did. I don't think his brother or his nephew Tyson could ever forgive him for that. They already feel kind of betrayed anyway. But I do get the feeling that Pete would like to train AJ. And just out of, not out of malice towards his nephew, but just because Peter is a boxing man. And I think he's frustrated that AJ's got so much ability, but he isn't being shown certain things. He isn't addressing certain issues. So just from a sporting perspective, I think Peter Fury would like to try and address those issues in AJ. And being too upright is definitely one of them. As far as him not taking Pulev out early, you know, I'm not going to be too harsh on AJ for that because he's dealing with demons. And even a great fighter like Lennox Lewis, it took him several fights before he was able to defeat the demons from the Oliver McCall fight. Anthony Joshua's only 2 fights removed from that knockout loss now. And unlike Lennox Lewis, he didn't have a bunch of rehabilitation fights that were non-world title fights against lower tier opposition. He's right back in fighting top 10 guys again. Dangerous guys who were coming to knock him out. So that's more pressure than Lennox Lewis was under when Lewis was fighting people like Lionel Butler, Justin Fortune, you know? So, yeah, that's my take on the fight. Kind of a strange one, but exciting. A lot of tension in the air. And this is ultimately why Anthony Joshua is a box office draw. Because he brings excitement and drama. And even though he's not as gung-ho as he used to be, because he's still vulnerable, that's going to make people want to tune in and watch. People don't believe in AJ as much as they used to. But they still like heavyweight boxing because of the element of drama. So let me know what you guys felt in the comments below about this performance, about this fight, Anthony Joshua versus Kubrat Pulev. How do you think Joshua will fare next? Do you, like me, believe he's going to need to improve significantly to defeat Tyson Fury based upon this performance? And again, when I say significantly, it doesn't need to be perfect to beat Tyson Fury. But for me, he definitely needs a lot more confidence, needs a lot more belief, and just a surety in what he's doing. Because in this fight, he was unsure. He'd throw a combination, then stop and hold. It was actually quite reminiscent of Vladimir Klitschko. The way that Vladimir Klitschko was in some fights. You know, he'd get close, he'd throw some shots, he'd realize they weren't having the effect that he wanted, and then he'd grab hold. He didn't have full confidence in himself, Vladimir, for most of his career. Same thing with AJ here. Anyway, let me stop waffling. I'm out. If you'd like to access all my boxing content advert-free and enjoy the convenience of listening via a podcast app with the option to download in high-quality MP3, then consider joining me on Patreon. In addition to the aforementioned perks, you'll also gain access to exclusive weekly live stream Q&A sessions and hangouts, as well as uncensored, no-holds-barred uploads, which are too blue for YouTube. This includes my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Boxing Extra. There's no contract, there's no commitment, it's only £2.50 a month, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of hardcore boxing enthusiasts by signing up with me here on Patreon today.